sort of general points about gender that are important to keep in mind. So we're talking about gender. And let me just introduce this by raising 3 general points, and then we'll start talking about some specific issues. So the first main point. The first main point, of course, is why. Why has gender been of so much interest to people who have looked at the Middle East? And the interesting thing is that it hasn't always been of interest in the same way. Right? So scholars, historians in particular, have been very interested in the way European, Victorian, British Victorian travelers to the Middle East were also really interested in gender relations. They're fascinated by relations between men and women, in particular, in the Middle East. But the image in the 19th century is quite different from the image in the late 20th century. And next Tuesday, I'm going to bring you a little short film that describes some of this representation. In the late 19th century, unlike in the late 20th century, the image is somewhat reversed. Whereas in the late 20th century, what is the image, the sort of standard image of the status or role of women in the world? Basically. What is the representation in the image of women in the Middle East? Standard.
One of, I'm forgetting the word, like oppression.
Yeah. So women are oppressed. Women are potentially sexually repressed. Right? There's an image of sexual repression and oppression. Right? That women have no power. They're unable to express what they want. They're, prevented from doing a whole host of jobs or being in the public space. And part of that has to do with an idea of sexual oppression. Now, what's so interesting is that there are a lot of travelers, European travelers, British Victorian travelers in particular, who traveled to the Middle East in the late 19th century, who presented a very opposite image, where women appeared incredibly open sexually. And part of it was this fantasy of belly dancing, right? The sort of Orientalist image of belly dancing and women being a part of the harem, right? So the sexual world of the Middle East in the 19th century looked just very opposite from the perspective of Europe. Again, on Tuesday, I'm going to bring you a little film showing sort of late 19th, early 20th century images of sexual life in the Middle East. And there you see, again, sort of the belly dancing and the harem. But on top of that, there are descriptions not only of male travelers to the Middle East who are, amazed by this belly dancing and harem thing, right? They go to the belly dancers and I can't believe that there are women performing like this, right? Because in Victorian London, this was not happening, right? So they couldn't believe this. But there are also women travelers to the Middle East who are also very impressed by this kind of explicit, outward, open, relatively public sexualized life, right? And historians have interpreted this as a sort of reflection on Victorian values, the control of Victorian repression, and then the idea that the Middle East was in fact a place where women were much more sexually free, much more sexually open. So it's a very interesting reversal. So that's one point to remember when we're talking about why gender in the Middle East, this sort of fantasy, this image of an extreme, either sexually open, more open or sexually repressed. Right? Now, the second sort of major part of this question of why or how gender in the Middle East has created been of such interest is, on the one hand, there's this question of the place of sexuality, whether it's totally open or totally repressed. But part of that is this idea that there is a very radical sex segregation, right? That women and men in public are separate. Right? So no matter what happens in the private home, in the public world, there's this idea that there are pretty strict regulation or control, not necessarily not legal, but social, practical control on maintaining a difference between where women go and where men go, as well as the relations between them in public. And so this was sort of this difference, this stark difference, has been of interest. And how does sex segregation affect people's ideas of equality, of access to whether it's political life or social life, economic life, and what is the relationship of that to the social hierarchy? Okay, so that, and then thirdly, this sort of fascination of the centrality of gender, the interest of gender in looking at the Middle East, is manifested in a third way. And that has to do with the way, at least in the late 20th century, and then into the 21st, in seeing the idea that women are oppressed in the Middle East as a reason for, let's say, political intervention in the Middle East. Right? So the idea is that women are oppressed in the Middle East. This is the notion that women are oppressed in the Middle East. And therefore, it is sort of in the realm of human rights, right? Universal human rights, for other parts of the world to help protect these women. Right? And so, for example, if you look at some of the rhetoric around the intervention in Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, a lot of that in the US was framed around the way the Taliban, who were in power in Afghanistan, were abusing women, right? So it was in the interest of human rights of all people that the US could therefore intervene or should intervene to protect women. Okay? So in all of these ways, you can see how gender becomes so central to the vision of what the Middle East is, whether it's on a political front or intervention, whether it's a question of sex segregation that seems quite different from social relations elsewhere in the world, and then thirdly, in terms of the place of sexuality, whether it's a sexuality that's supposedly outward and public, right, not repressed at all, or that seems incredibly oppressed and repressed. And so on these three fronts, gender becomes central to how people think about the world.
So three things you talk about: segregation, political intervention. What was the first one?
And the first one had to do with the place of sexuality, right? Whether it's on the sort of side of being repressed, open, in the late 19th century, the idea of the belly dancing and the harems and so forth, as opposed to the late 20th century, where the image is the opposite, right? That there is sexual repression rather than. Okay. So that's one sort of major theme for us to think about when we're thinking about the place of gender, the role of gender in the Middle East. The two one. The second theme that I think is really important to think about is that when we're speaking about gender in the Middle East, it's very important as social scientists, to remember that, of course, not all the Middle East is the same. But more than that, there are very clear, there's some patterns within that. And one of the dominant patterns is that there's a difference between urban and rural ideas of sort of sex segregation, practices of sex segregation, and gender relations. And there are also class differences. So urban-rural and class dynamics affect, at least, in general, patterns of sex segregation in the Middle East. More specifically, our ideas, generally the idea is that, traditionally, very traditional societies, there is more sex segregation. And by traditional, people often think of rural, right? Urban is where the cosmopolitan, the new, the shopping malls that we talked about, right? All of that. And the rural is where it's traditional, where the sex segregation would be more. What has been interesting for anthropologists and sociologists is that, in fact, what we find is that in a lot of the rural areas, there is less sex segregation than in the urban areas. Right? So on the one hand, we have this image of, the shopping malls and people going around and all in the same place, and they're, modern, and so there's less sex segregation. But in fact, it seems that it's quite reversed. In the rural areas, there's less sex segregation than in the urban areas. Why do you think that might be?
I'm a little back and forth here. Because I think we discussed last time we discussed that the women didn't have time to be bored, that the men were smoking hashish.
Right, in that article of Egypt, right?
Was that in the urban area, or was that the rural? That was the rural?
That was one article about rural experiences in Egypt, right? And the men were, bored and going to watch soccer and smoking pot.
I think that it seems like there's more segregation in the urban because the times are changing, and I guess sexism is uprising, and
yeah.
I'm a little going back and forth here with the rural and the urban areas because I saw it a little differently. But then again, the sexism is uprising, and the men are trying to be the men of the house, having the women stay at home doing the housework, and the men do this and that.
But were they staying home? That's what they yeah.
I was just guessing that it's probably more segregated in the cities as compared to the rural areas because in cities, you have high population. I guess that's what government is centralized, so I guess there's more of a chance to, to enforce the law, I guess. But then in a rural area, I guess there's not as many opportunities for public activities or constant transportation, constant movement of people or interactions between different sectors.
Yeah, I mean, if the state were interested in maintaining sex segregation, it's possible that in a city that it might be it would be easier to control, or at least the breadth of state control. But not all states are really interested or that interested in maintaining. Iran, presumably yes, but as you saw from African uprising, on one level. Or we saw in the film, right on the soccer field. At one level of the state, and then of course the soldiers who are the state and yet they're armed for the state. So what do you think?
I was thinking that in the rural setting is probably much more of a familial connection to everybody, so that there's less of a requirement for government step in and mandate, so that they police themselves, but also they know everybody. So there's no need to be familiar or represent the piety out there.
That's very true.
One other thing I want to go a little back, not in modern time, but what we was taught, there were the two different groups: the sedentary, the agriculturists, which are the urban area, the sedentary, the agriculture, the urban people, and the other one is the nomads, the pastoral nomads.
So
So
we're talking
basically,
about, like, remember we talked about settled,
Yeah,
nomads,
nomads.
as opposed to urban rural, so if we do that.
yeah.
okay.
So for example, the nomads, they have to carry their woman everywhere, wherever there's no time to segregate their woman. They have to do together everything. And in the agriculture area, they have all these rules and regulations. Yeah, that's one of the things we were taught in earlier history of Turkish.
Okay, so if we're thinking in that way, we're talking about the, the Bedouin versus the settled, right, the Bedouin dichotomy as opposed to urban and rural. In that sense, maybe in the nomads would be less sex segregated. I guess a lot of these things, you're absolutely right. So what a lot of anthropologists and sociologists have come to think about in this regard is that in the rural areas, part of it is a familial, everyone's there, everyone knows each other, there's a self-regulating, but also because women are part of the agricultural productive economy, they're out in the fields, right? Women are not simply at home working. And even if they are caring for the domestic arrangement, they are also caring for family members throughout the neighborhood. And so there's a constant movement of women and men through the shared spaces of a village. Right? So the image of somehow a traditional village where women are confined to the home. So even though the idea was that, right, they're saying, well, in that article they were talking about the women being unable to be bored. There's no time to be bored because they had all this stuff to do. Where the guys, they seem to have nothing to do, so they had the luxury of being bored, right? And being bored, as we talked about, was not only about not having anything to do, but having no hope in this idea of some kind of love. But in that image, even though they're responsible for the domestic life, it doesn't mean that in terms of the spatial arrangement, they're not also all over the village. And so the sex segregation, the idea of the sex segregation, is not actually as acute in the villages in some kind of image of a traditional life as one might imagine. Okay? And in fact, in the cities where there's a lot of, human population, and there are women obviously out going to work, going to school. It's not as though also sex segregation, but there's a lot more control or concern about unknown people, right? There's a lot more fear about, so like the soccer game, right? The soccer game was a perfect example, right? And here we're talking about a state that's, the Islamic Republic is invested in laws about sex segregation. But the point is that the fear was that there are all this public, right? The mass groups of men at a stadium in a city, and that's where the women speak. Whereas, what does the man say about his mother? She's out in the field she's out in the field with the cows. Is everyone following this? So the idea of what a public is, where it's okay to be, is not quite as straightforward as one might imagine. In the traditional role of the village, there's sex segregation, whereas in the city, because it's cosmopolitan and modern, there isn't. In fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. Related to that, right, it's sort of a general issue for us to think about, is a question of class. And again, one of the interesting features of this that sociologists and anthropologists have come to pay attention to is that though the idea, right, that the upper classes are somehow more educated and somehow more cosmopolitan than the working classes, and therefore less segregation, in fact, we found the opposite. There is much more sex segregation in the upper classes, in the elite, than there is in the working classes. Okay. And again, part of it is the luxuries or the ideas of protection of elite women, not mixing with not only men, but the working class. Right? So the idea of protection is not simply a gender one. Is everyone following? So again, one of the main points or general themes to think about when thinking about gender is our notions of what traditional is in terms of sex segregation. Sometimes are often much more complicated than the idea of a traditional village where, you know, villagers are much more sex segregated than either the elite, the cosmopolitan city. You find it's actually often the reverse. Okay. So that's the second general. The third general point that I want us to think about that's really important, and this has come up a couple times already, particularly when we read the book for sex, and we talked about it since then, which is that historically, in the 20th century, right, in particular, we look at the 20th century, there have been dramatic changes over the course of the 20th century in terms of the phenomenon of veiling. And we'll talk about, never mind sex segregation, and we'll talk about the specific idea of veiling within the notion of sex segregation. Okay? Because veiling ultimately is about covering, right, or hiding, right? And if we're talking about sex segregation, that's what it's a reflection of, right? Veiling has to do with protecting, hiding, covering. Right? It's a form, it's an acted on your body, a kind of covering. And that's related to sex segregation. So, but in thinking about the 20th century, what we see is dramatic shifts in veiling over the course of the 20th century. So it's not as though, you know, veiling, the practice of veiling has been so incredibly common all through the 20th century. So let's go. And the question is, at what periods over the course of the 20th century has the phenomenon of veiling increased? And at what periods is it less common? So just to remind ourselves some of the other things we've talked about up to now, is that in the 1920s, remember, in the 1920s, we have two new major political entities emerging in the Middle East. The Pahlavi dynasty in Iran, right, in 1925. Remember, Reza Shah overthrows the Qajar dynasty in 1925. Similarly, in the 1920s, after the First World War, Mustafa Kamal Attaturk, right, so Reza Shah in Iran, and Attaturk in Turkey, right? The Ottoman Empire collapses after the First World War. We talked about this a lot, right? So, two major new political forms, states, emerge in the 1920s. And we talked about how these two leaders, right, kind of a president, and then a king who first wanted to be a president, but then was convinced not to be a president, but to be a king, right? Imagine themselves as leaders of these modern nationalist states, right? And one of the first things, one of the most things that these two leaders did in their idea of modernizing these states had to do with gender. Because they believed that gender equality was incredibly important to establishing a modern state. So they formed, emphasized education for women. That is very important to them. But more than that, they took on some very symbolic acts, legal acts. And in particular, they both outlawed the veil. So, of course, not every woman was wearing, and by veil, it doesn't necessarily mean covering the face, it just means covering the hair, right? That's that's why veil is not really an accurate term. It's not. It's like a headscarf, it's just covering the hair. Some women also cover their face, but mostly it's just covering the hair. But both of these leaders just banned it, right? Outlawed. They also instituted some laws regulating male attire, right? Reza Shah Pahlavi also insisted that, remember I talked about men wear ties? I mean, of course, it's kind of absurd, right? Allowed them to go into this around the tie, but anyway, this was an idea of what a modern state is going to be, right? For women, it was removing the veil. And of course, there was a huge backlash, right? But not everyone opposed it. There was a lot of support for it. All of the idea of sort of the modern state, what a modern state is going to be like, that women were not going to be, their hair wasn't going to be covered, they were going to be going to school, they were going to have jobs, and there was mixed responses. Opposition to that, like at least in terms of a forcing people not to wear a veil, but also support for these laws. So that was one wave of this kind of modernization, and it sort of petered out, and people started to wear the veil again anyway, or they didn't listen to the law, right? So that was one wave. Now, and it sort of petered out, but then in the 1950s and 60s, you have another wave of states also not necessarily outlawing the veil, but instituting reforms, legal reforms, that were aimed at what they imagined as gender equality. Right? So what that meant was reforming, in particular, family law throughout the Middle East. And this came on the heels, as we've talked about, in the 1950s, the post-colonial, as these states gained independence from England, France, right, or overturned monarchs like in Iraq, right? The Ba'athist regime gets rid of the king, and in getting rid of the king is establishing a republic, a new state, a modern state that's modernist, that's nationalist, and in Iraq also socialist. And what is socialism about in the image of the 1950s and 60s states? Equality, right? And not just class equality, but gender equality. Right? That's the point of these post-colonial states, is to establish, in the wake of colonialism, is to establish equality. And then again, it's not simply about class equality or equality between colonizer and colonized, but also gender. And so, again, there's a whole host, right, from Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, under Nasser, right, Saddam Hussein, Iraq. Right, all of these states are very invested in reforming family law, providing education, and sometimes outlawing the housewife. Is everyone following? So, if you look at films from the 1950s in Egypt, I mean, there are very few women who are covered in headscarf. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually when I was responding to women in the veil, I found an article about a woman and a veil as a reporter. The thing that the article was about was there was women that wore veils on TV, but it was only on private channels, which was very rare. And one day, the reporter decided to wear her veil on a public channel, and that just became like a whole backlash, and it created so much controversy. But right after her, three more women after that decided to wear theirs, and then it became like a symbol of justice, but of the media, because it seemed as the media started like oppressing the freedom of the veils and their
Right, so the freedom to wear it,
yeah.
right? So the injustice, the oppression became the, inability to wear it, rather than the oppression of wearing it, the existing of it. Right?
It's just interesting that they have even private channels for women that are able to, like, but they have two separate broadcasting channels, private channels and public channels, ones where they are able to wear the veils and ones where they are not.
Because one is representing the state,
And then they
right? You're gonna, I think, see there's a,
Oh no, it's just interesting.
yeah. Right, so, I mean, and I, there's also, I even, besides these particular states, where we're talking about Algeria, right, where they gained independence from France and
I think that's from
established from
Algeria.
Algeria, right? So, where there's the idea of the anti-French, the revolution against France and the War of Independence in Algeria it became an explicitly socialist state. And in that socialist state, the ideology, of course, was equality, not only of class, and not only against, the oppression of the colonizer-colonized relationship, but for gender as well. And the image in Algeria is that women were very, and this is, a representation, and people have argued and questioned the degree to which this is true, that women were very much part of the war for independence in Algeria, right? And so the idea was that women took out, planted bombs throughout Algiers and the Battle of Algiers and so on. So there's the presence of women in fighting the French becomes part of the idea of the independent Algeria. Right? Has anyone seen the Battle of Algiers film? Battle of Algiers? You should watch that. It's classic, violent but classic film that describes an early period in the war against France where these sort of cells start fighting against the French army. And it presents the image of, remember we talked about the Islamic city and the colonial city, so you can see that division. You also see women in this film, at least as represented in this film, as participating very centrally to the war effort. I mean, the guerrilla war. In that they're the ones who are able to go through the checkpoints more easily. Why? But so they're living in the old Islamic city in the Kasbah, and the French cordon off the Kasbah to control it, right? Because there's guerrilla fighting, and they're taking out military officials, French military officials all over Algiers. And so the French respond by blockading it. But it's the women in this film who get through the checkpoints, fighting competitive. Okay.
No, I was thinking maybe seduction.
Partly, that's a good guess, seduction. But besides seduction, that would be one way. Patrick, yeah. They could, but that's not what happens. Yeah.
The French had like an old engagement mentality where it was like there'd be a fixed military organization and not necessarily a guerrilla war, so they were looking for men as being the attackers and not necessarily women.
That's excellent. It's actually just hold on to that thought because that's an excellent response. So part of it is that they're only looking for men as potential attackers, right? Because they have a very fixed idea of what a war is, right? They're not used to guerrilla, right? Engaging in combat, so they're not used to guerrilla warfare, right? In the city. So that's part of it, and so that gets the structure of the cells and how they manage it. But it also is that the women, the French soldiers, feel very uncomfortable and will not pat down a woman, right? Because they don't have female soldiers, right? So French male soldiers and the women are coming through the checkpoints, and the women dress up French. They dye their hair, And so they kind of like this, they flirt. So they sort of flirt with and then they go through the checkpoints, and the soldiers, the male soldiers, are one, uncomfortable, they will not pat down a Algerian woman, and two, they think that because they're dressed modern, they're not going to be in opposition. Right? Anyway, so this is like the idea, and so just to get back to your point about the way that the guerrilla warfare was so successful is that the Algerian resistance organized itself in these cells, right, where you would only know one person or one or two people in your cell. And French military sort of broke the cell by using torture and figuring out, sort of working backwards to the top. And this film was actually shown to the U.S. military in working in Iraq and Afghanistan to try to understand how to break cell units. So that's another part of this whole story. But the point here is that the image of women as participating in the wars of independence throughout the Middle East, and the idea of having a modern, socialist, nationalist state throughout the region sort of entered into the establishment of these new states in the post-World War I, and then ultimately in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of these states instituted very clear reforms, legal reforms. So the most famous might be in Turkey, but Tunisia also instituted pretty dramatic legal reforms, family reforms, and in particular, outright banned polygamy. Right? So one of the sticking points in gender relations, in thinking about gender relations in the Middle East, is not only sex segregation, but the second part of that, the part that has been fascinating to Europeans and so forth, is the legal right to marry up to 4 women, right? Because it's in the Quran, and in the Quran it's very explicit that a man can marry up to 4 wives. Now, how states deal with that is very interesting, because Tunisia set an example in outlawing polygamy based on another part of that Quranic gift, which is what? You know? The mirror, yes.
All 4 wives equally.
Exactly. So in the Quran, not only does it say you can marry up to 4 wives, but the second part of that is that you have to treat the 4 equally. Yes.
There's a group called modernists. They came out with the notion that, okay, so if you can treat all 4 equally, so you don't have to marry 4, so just outlaw it.
Right. So the idea, the modernist, the interpretation, the legal response to that is that it's impossible to treat 4 people equally. So the Quran in itself is saying you can marry up to 4 wives, but you must treat them equally. And the lawyers, right, and the state says, well, as we know, it is absolutely impossible to treat 4 people equally. So you cannot have 4 wives. And this turned out to be a standard model. Tunisia instituted it, but it's become a very public, very explicit model that people use in getting divorce, in preventing or saying, my husband took another wife, but he's treating me unequally, right? So it's something that is not only in law in a place like Tunisia, but also explicit. Okay. So now we're talking about periods in the 1920s and the 1950s and 60s where we have this sort of push of gender equality and laws prohibiting veiling, as well as family law reforms preventing polygamy, but also insisting on very particular forms of inheritance, marriage, divorce, right? They're clear across the Middle East. Now, what is interesting is that by the end of the 20th century, what we have is another shift, where we have a kind of taking up of the practice of veiling more. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, right, and into the 70s, there was a lot of public pressure. There was, this idea of sort of the social idea of equality and a socialist, modernist, nationalist image of taking off the veil. From the 70s on, and now it seems to be in a very interesting phase too, we have a lot of women, young women, wearing the veil more. And so you get these interesting tensions. Remember I talked about, you think of the rural-urban divide is kind of flipped, the class divide. But it's also interesting because there are lots of generational tensions. Well, one thinks that the older generation is somehow going to be more traditional and therefore wear the veil, and the young people are not going to want to wear the veil. When in fact, it's kind of a real reversal, where you see the older people either not wearing the veil or wearing the veil in a less rigid way, and the young people taking on the veil in a stricter way.
I actually wrote that also in my response. I wrote that what I wrote was, it's great to see some of the people still carrying on their culture, their background, and their tradition. A shame to see others let that go. I just had that thought in my mind. It was just the same thing that I thought. That others, like the olders, are taking it down, while the younger generation is taking it up a notch, and it's just twisting and spinning around. It's like iron.
Yeah, it's very interesting. How do you feel about that?
I was just wondering if it had anything to do with like a propaganda campaign, as opposed to like just this is what you have to do, this is how things are, or if there was like now a more modern kind of like personal approach to it, like with the secular or non-secular music that was like becoming popular, so like the Muslim rock sort of thing, like making it appealing to the youth, as opposed to just this is how it is and you have to do it. I wonder if that was at play.
It's very interesting. I mean, there's definitely, so on the one hand, yes, you could say that there is a popularizing, but the reason, and this comes to the Helen Watson article, right? So the question there is, why, we'll get to it in a second, on an individual level, why are some of these women deciding to wear the veil where they might not have earlier, right? And part of it is social pressure, right? To be what everyone else is doing and it's the right thing to do. Part of it may be a reaction, this is one interpretation, that it's a reaction to the failure of the previous states, right? And trying to be modernist, nationalist, sometimes socialist, sometimes not. Those states, from the perspective of a lot of everyday people, sort of failed. Right? They didn't provide the economic bounty. They didn't provide the actual equality in terms of political life. Right? There's a lot of political repression. And so those states, from the perspective, were just copying Europe. Right? So the colonialism is over, but the states that they got after were still just trying to be European in being West. They're just trying to be Western, right? And they're forgetting their supposed tradition. The question is, okay, what is tradition? But there's a phrase in Persian called and this means, in Persian, like West-toxification, which means sort of being so enamored by the West that you're almost drunk, right? You're sort of, so there's a very specific, phrase in Persian that describes these sort of so on the one hand, anti-colonial, right? On the other hand, sort of reproducing some notion of Western speech. West-toxification. It's like a made-up word, West-toxification, right? Intoxicated. Basically intoxicated by the West. Like the West makes you drunk with thinking that you want to be like that. So in Iran, there's an actual word to talk about this idea, right? That you're so enamored, you're drunken by to be just like the West. And this gets to, people's reaction to the idea that whereas in the 50s and 60s, these modern nationalist states encouraged certain policies, by the late 70s, into the 80s, maybe there's something we're missing, right? What else happened in 1979, of course? This Iranian Revolution, an Islamic revolution. And, if you can think about how the ripple, the importance, you have, a revolution, a modern revolution, that is able to, kick out a king that has a huge backing of the U.S. military, massive backing of the U.S. military, and you have a popular revolution in the name of Islam. Of course, we talked about how, in fact, the revolution included Marxists and included communists and included nationalists and Democrats and all of these, but as the revolution unfolded, it became an Islamic revolution. And so the idea that you have an Islamic revolution that will fight off that power successfully and set up a republic. Okay, maybe there's repression, but, and especially in the early periods of the revolution, but ultimately it's a republic. Where people vote, where there was a press. Like the early 10 years of the revolution was very violent, but after that we had a violent press, more than in the first Gulf states. And so that, in a way, became a model. Even if it's Shia, even if it's, they're all controlled. So, you can see that the response, some of these women who end up taking up the veil have that image of a very powerful background for the relationship. Okay. What I want to do now, so these are, again, the three sort of general themes to this. One, again, gender in the Middle East as being the major topic, or field of vision and thinking about the Middle East. Secondly, of course, to think about our assumptions of what is traditional and what is modern. Sometimes they're much more complicated than over time. And thirdly, so related to that second one, is that over the course of the 20th century, it's not that we start off with some necessary tradition that we know, but it's a lot more messy, right? And in fact, the early 20th century was very much about insisting on social equality, gender equality, and even to the point of violence and removal. All right. Are there questions about these three general things? What I want to do now is to pass out just a little bit from the Quran, just for those of you who have not had a chance to read any of the Quran. I'm going to give you, here are 3 pages. 2 of the pages are from a chapter called Light. And this is something that Watson talked about, right? It is chapter 24 in the Quran. And as Watson talked about in the article we read, there are different, technically, you say interpretation of the Quran and not translation of the Quran. Does anyone can you imagine why you would say interpretation and not translation of the Quran? Or you could have that? Yeah. You get it. Okay, so this is another, and this is from chapter 30. It's coming around this way and coming around that way. Karen, if you get it, you can share it. So this is from one of the Quranic interpretations that Watson cites of the Arbery interpretation. And if you have extra, you want to There are 3 pages. One is 48, 49. Who needs 48, 49? Aaron. What is that one? And 50, 51. Who needs 50, 51? You need 50, 51? 50, 51. 40, there are 3 pages. 48, one that's 48, 49, then 50, 51. And then there's a third one called Confederate. Where is that one? Who has that file? Thank you. You don't need that. Who needs Confederates? Confederates. Okay. All right. So, just going back. So Watson, in the article that you read, wants us to think about potentially some of the places in the Quran where sex segregation, in particular veiling, comes from. Where is cited in the Quran? So let me just say something about the Quran first, which is she discusses a couple different interpretations of the Quran. And we say interpretation instead of translation because technically you cannot translate, literally it would be impossible to translate the words of God, right? You cannot. It's technically impossible. And so often what you have is people saying the interpretation, maybe in English or French or German or Persian, anything besides Arabic, right? Because the Quran is revealed in Arabic, and so you cannot, when it's moved into another language, technically it would become an interpretation and not a translation. Is everyone following? And that's why we say Quran. Okay? So that's one thing to know. This particular interpretation, so every interpretation is going to be a little different, right? Because when you render it in another language, you have to choose a range of meanings, right? And so the meanings, the words are going to change. The inflection of the kind of tone is going to change. Arbery's interpretation, which she cites, which is often used in English, is one of the more poetically apt. So it captures the poetry of the Quran. But in terms of the technical accuracy, it sort of takes some liberties. Is everyone following? So to make it more poetic, as the Quran is poetic, the terms, there is some. So the terms are not as precise as it often might be or could be using other words. Is everyone seeing the difference? Okay. But this is the interpretation that's often used. Right. So Watson, in presenting the question of veiling, frames it in a number of ways. One, she frames it in saying, okay, when people look at the Middle East and look at Judaism, we're talking about a whole bunch of different things because there are different styles, right? From just a headscarf to full face cover to like fashionable, you you can go for a Gucci scarf, or you can go for a no name brand, right? And all of those things are markers. They signify, they symbolize class, they symbolize status, they symbolize relationships, they symbolize society, right? So you have a huge, and there are also styles that are sort of nationally bound, right? So in Iran, people will might wear a tie under your, like in Egypt, right? You can tie it under. In Oman, you wouldn't do that. You sort of wrap it around your head, right? Some places it's more common to wear like a robe over your shoulder, something sitting on your head. There's just a whole range. Some are colorful, some are not colorful. There are lots of matching, right? There's a whole range of possibilities in terms of actual fashion, right? Because there's fashion. All right. Then she turns to the question of, so what does it actually say in the Quran? Because if we're going to take as Islamic law the necessity of covering, what does the Quran actually say? So that's why I'm providing it. And she references a number of different verses, but I brought you two sections, one from verse 24 called Light, and one from, chapter 24 called Light, and one from chapter 33 called Confederate. Now, Watson also mentions, before we do this, Watson also mentions, remember, she talks about some of the verses being Meccan, from Mecca, the Mecca stage, and some from the Medina stage. Does anyone remember what that is? Yeah,
yeah, so basically, like, the Quran was built over a period of 10 years in Mecca and Medina, and the Meccans, it's different because it's basically based on strengthening a person's beliefs, but then Medina is more technical in terms of like the laws or the policies, like how to enforce it basically. Because once they have that belief set, they can like follow it.
Exactly. So do you remember when we talked about the start of the Islamic calendar, right? The 622. Why 622?
So you get that repeat it to the heart.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
the year they moved to Medina.
Exactly.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's put you on the spot. I'm sorry. So, perfect. So, the year the Muslim followers of Muhammad went from the town of Mecca to the town of Medina is the start of the Islamic calendar. It's the beginning, because it's the symbolic beginning of the community, right? But the Quran was revealed while Muhammad was in Mecca and while Muhammad was in Medina. And what scholars have found is that there's a slight difference in the kinds of revelations in Mecca and the kinds of revelations in Medina. The revelations that are in Mecca are much more about, as Mamadou said, about strengthening the spiritual beliefs of the community, right? There's a lot about the hereafter, right? About fear of God, about the justice of God. There's a lot of much more spiritual language. The chapters that are revealed in Medina are much more specific in terms of enacted law. Do this, do that, do this, do that. And that has to do with, the scholars have argued, strengthening the everyday practices of people in the community. So she discusses this. Now, let's look at, she talks about 4 different chapters, but I just brought in 2 to give you a sense. So, on chapter The Light, which is chapter 24 of the Quran, at the bottom of page 49, verse, section 30. You see that? At the bottom of page 49. Everyone with me? So this is one of the most cited places for thinking about the veil, where the Quran talks about the veil. So, say to the believers that they cast down their eyes and guard their private parts. That is pure. God is aware of the things they work. And say to the believing women that they cast down their eyes and guard their private parts, and reveal not their adornment, save such as is outward, and let them cast their veils over their bosoms, and not reveal their adornment, save to their husbands or their fathers or their husbands' fathers, or their sons or their husbands' sons, or their brothers or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, or what their right hands own, or such men as attend them, not having sexual desire, or children who have not yet attained knowledge of women's private parts, nor let them stamp their feet so that their hidden ornament may be known. So what do you think that is? Stamp their feet so that their... Anyway, let's read the whole thing. So that their hidden ornament may be known, and turn altogether to God. O you believers, act these so you will prosper. Okay. This is one of the primary sections of the Quran that speak to that.
Saying cover yourselves and some of people that are related to the part of men that are unrelated to you. You can only unveil yourself in front of your father or like men who are like related to like your father, your son, your brother, your sister's son. And I think right hands own are like people who work in your house. And I'm not sure what and children are with, but I don't know what stands for people.
Maybe don't call attention to yourself. Don't call attention to anything that should be kept for only family members and stuff like that.
That's right. So, I mean, what it's saying a couple of different things, right? I mean, it's saying, guard their private parts and reveal not their adornment. So the question is, what constitutes adornment? Okay. It's not clear. It's not saying cover your hair. Is there anything in here that says cover your hair? No. What is it saying? What are you covering? Private parts. Right? It's saying cover your private part. It's saying cover your bosom. Right? It's not saying cover your hair. So that's the first thing to note. Right? It's not to say that interpretation. I'm just saying that in the Quran, in this section that's often cited, it doesn't say cover your hair. It says cast down their eyes and guard their private parts, and reveal not their adornment, save such as is outward, and let them cast their veils over their bosoms, and not reveal their adornment. So one might say adornment is hair. Right?
But at the same time, it talks about children who have not yet attained knowledge of women's private parts.
Huh?
So it can't be talking about hair there.
What do you mean?
Because it says, or children who have not yet attained knowledge of women's private parts. So private parts can't include hair, because all the children can get rid of hair.
Well, the question is, who are you hiding this from? Who can see who can see your adornment? Right? So the question is, we have two questions. One, what is adornment? What constitutes adornment? That's the first question. And the second question is, who is allowed to see that adornment? And here we have a very clear list of people who can. And clear that anyone else is excluded from that. right? And so the people who can see your adornment would be children. Children who have no knowledge of sexual life can see your adornment. Now, the question of what adornment is, that's a whole separate section. It's a whole separate question. But the people who can see your adornment would be children. But there are other interesting, who is listed in this is interesting, right? Husband's sons. So that suggests that your husband has other sons besides you. And that's interesting. Your own. Or their brothers. Or their brother's sons, they're okay. Your sister's sons, so your nephews, that's fine. And so all these people within your immediate your immediate familial life is fine. So that's separate from what adornment is. Then we have the question of stamping your feet. So is it, or let them stamp their feet so that their hidden ornament may be known. What's that? Is it, yeah?
I took it as that woman essence, that like, if I have no idea of what constitutes a woman, so like either fieriness or whatever separated away from that, Adam and Eve state. Like it bases back to that, and women carrying with them the burden of original sin or original deviation. So that's the hidden adornment. That's kind of what I got out of it.
Wait, say that again?
So it was like the woman, the female essence that kind of characteristically separates female from male. I took that as the hidden adornment because that's a lot of the relations in the article was talking about the division coming from Adam and Eve, and Eve being responsible for first getting the bite of the apple for knowledge, and that being the legal division.
Yeah, I don't know if that doesn't seem to me, but maybe that could be the adornment. Adornment being something that's threatening, right? That's the underlying idea, right? That adornment is seductive, right? So the women carry the adornment by nature, is what they're saying, and therefore that adornment needs to be seen. But the other part of this too is, okay, so maybe it's, you can read and you can interpret. What does this mean? Maybe it means dancing, right? You're stamping your feet. Maybe that's dancing. So if you stamp your feet, it's possible that your clothes will fall off. What was her name? We had this Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction, right? Right? She was stamping her feet and her adornment fell off. Her covering fell off, right? So, there you go. Yeah.
I kept thinking it was jewelry for some weird reason. Like, cover your jewelry
Well, that's very interesting, right? Because adornment sounds to be not so much an essence of woman, but maybe an addition to, so one could interpret the adornment that way. That I have adornment that's not simply of essence to me as a woman because all women have adornment, but maybe adornment is something that's added on like jewelry. And then you have to hide our jewelry that we add on just for our husbands. Right? And so there we have two different interpretations. So I can wear jewelry, but no one else can see except for my family. Or I am born, when I reach sexual puberty, have adornment that's of essence to me that needs to be. And those are two different interpretations. So if I didn't wear jewelry, in your interpretation, right? If I didn't wear jewelry, I would have nothing to hide. Right? So I would have nothing to veil. But in your interpretation, as soon as I hit puberty, basically, I have stuff to hide. And again, it's the word adornment that's hard to interpret, right? Or that sort of creates the wiggle room for interpretation. And is it dancing? Possibly. Or is it just don't stomp your feet? Right? Women, don't stomp your feet, your clothes might fall off, right? That's the issue. But then she talks about in Watson's article, then she shifts to the question of interpretation, because here we are able to read the Quran, okay, in English, and just question and just think, well, what does it mean? Because let's say you're the Tunisian state, and you say, it just says don't do it. So just don't do it. And you're fine. And you say, no, that's not what it says. What it says is, you're born with the garment because you're female. But nowhere here does it say anything about hair. Then someone else says, well, it doesn't say anything about hair, so why are we worrying about covering our hair? And someone else said, no, hair is out of it. And then someone else says, well, I have hair. Is it there to women? Do you see where all of this is going to, like a whole level of debate and interpretation that's just beyond, and this is just the Quran, right? And it's important to remember, we'll run out of time, it's important to remember that the laws upon which, or the sources on which the laws are based, or the notions of the laws are based, are not simply the Quran, but the practices and sayings of the Prophet. And it's there where the example of what the Prophet Muhammad did was to encourage or require women to wear a veil. And so that's where more of the language of veiling, actual veiling, comes from, and not the Quran itself. The Quran itself doesn't actually say anything about that. And of course, so just that one section is ultimately, never mind. So, on Tuesday,